were like walking up these stairs going to the stage. And I sort of touched him on his arm. And I said, Don, what do you mean by that? I like sort of, you know, talk. And he said, don't you ever touch me. You know, the last person who touched me ended up on the ground dead. And I was like, all right, man. And I had this sort of flush come over me. And I was like, am I going to get in a fight with Don Young? Like, am I going to punch Don Young? I was like, no, that's insane.
And this was as you were walking on stage?
Yeah, it was, we were walking up the stairs to like the back, the holding area behind the stage. And I was like, that's insane. Just catch your breath, like relax.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. In 2014, just before his 30th birthday, our guest made a name for himself when he attempted to unseat Alaska's long-term lone congressman, Don Young. Although he ultimately failed in his quest, with just a shoestring budget, Forrest Dunbar had upended expectations, earning 41% of the vote and establishing himself as a force to be reckoned with. We discuss his childhood in rural Alaska, his decision to become a lawyer, and how he ended up in the Alaska State Senate. But we begin by talking about the most recent U.S. Supreme Court decisions that had just been released when we recorded this interview on the morning of Friday, June 30th. You will hear us reference the Dobbs decision. And just a reminder for folks, the Dobbs decision from 2022 overturned Roe versus Wade, which is the Supreme Court decision that had legalized abortion across the country 50 years ago.
Forrest Dunbar, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Big news this morning, actually the last couple of days with the Supreme Court.
Sure.
Overturning affirmative action yesterday, ruling President Biden's student loan forgiveness unconstitutional. I don't know, is that correct? You're the lawyer.
I haven't read the decision in its entirety. I think what they ruled that he didn't have the authority to do what he did under the statute. I mean, I guess it's constitutional in the sense that they have the authority to do that by saying he essentially violated separation of powers. Again, I haven't read the actual decision. And there was also another decision that I'm sure you're getting to that there's a First Amendment right to discriminate against LGBT people if you are engaged in sort of creative commerce, I guess you might want to call it.
Yes.
All of those decisions are sort of narrower than the headline might suggest, but they all kind of push in the same direction. And that is to say, the law is just sort of whatever the Supreme Court says it is, because it's very clear that there are sort of strong arguments on the opposite side in every case. Even if you believe that it's the right policy decision, the idea that the Supreme Court is sort of forced by the Constitution to reach these decisions is kind of obviously false on its face. And so to me, that's kind of like, if you're looking for one principle to find out of all these decisions, it's that this Supreme Court will find, based on their ideology, what they want to find, regardless of what the law says. And that's unfortunate. And I think it further delegitimizes the court. But I don't really, honestly, I don't think the federal judiciary is legitimate in the way that people thought of it as being legitimate even 5 or 10 years ago. To those that still sort of harbored this notion that it was about precedent and jurisprudence and sort of rationally looking at the laws as they're constructed, or this sort of almost laughably false ideas about originalism, that you're finding some kind of like tablet from on high and this is this historical understanding of what these texts are. That's nonsense. It's all a fig leaf. It's the exercise of political power and really nothing much more.
Right. Well, obviously the finding about religious freedom to be able to not make a website for a gay couple is more personal for me. I think, so for listeners, we're recording this on Friday, June 30th in the morning. So we have these decisions have just been released.
Sure.
So neither of us have had a chance to digest them in whole. I mean, so if I talk about it just generally, that last year, Dobbs. This year we have these 3 decisions. I think depending on who you are, the student loan one might be a super huge one, but affirmative action and then the freedom to discriminate against LGBTQ people when doing artistic work seems pretty groundbreaking, like just really steps backwards.
I think yes and no. And I think that I have a friend who is an admissions director, and they wrote, her name's Asha Rangappa. She wrote a pretty detailed thread about how admissions offices are going to sort of get around the decision. Not even get around it. I mean, you can read the decision and say, okay, well, we're not allowed to take this factor into account. Mm-hmm. Of course, we can still take your geography into account. We can still take the fact that you're a legacy. If you're a wealthy,
ridiculous.
If you're a wealthy white person from Wyoming, you're still going to get all this favorable treatment. But I'll say that there are ways for admissions offices to say, okay, well, write about your experience in your essay, and you can take that into account, because it was always so. The old jurisprudence was the educational benefits of diversity, which are kind of obvious on their face. I mean, you want people from diverse backgrounds in classes so that people can learn from each other, right? At all levels. But that was sort of the old jurisprudence. But like Dobbs, so in the Dobbs case, you had 50 years of precedent, right? That this was an enshrined right that was fundamental to a lot of people, really to everyone in the way our society functions. And the Supreme Court just threw it out because, again, it doesn't matter what the jurisprudence is or the precedent is for this Supreme Court. It only matters, as the Federal Society made pretty clear back in the 80s, and they've been working towards this for 40 years, just the exercise of political power. When I was in law school, I was in what's called a small group. So my law school had these small groups where you had 15 to 20 kids and you were assigned one professor and you had the most classes with just that little group. And the idea was to sort of build camaraderie and break down the competitive nature that got us to that place in the first place. And you learned from that professor in these small group settings. And my professor happened to be a constitutional law professor named Paul Gewirtz. And he had clerked for Thurgood Marshall, the first Black Supreme Court justice. And he and I got into an argument because I was, in my early 20s and I thought I knew everything. And I remember it very distinctly, though. It was first semester law school. Maybe it was second semester. But the point is, he asserted, he had these arguments about constitutional law. He was a constitutional law professor. And so he was teaching about these concepts of, these precedents and these through lines on constitutional law and how this meant you had to find this decision or that decision. And I'd come from DC. I went to college in DC. I'd worked on the Hill. I'd sort of seen, even at that early, this is in 2009 or 2010, I'd already seen what Mitch McConnell was kind of up to. I think people that had been following knew what was happening. And I knew what the Federal Society was and all that kind of thing. And so I said, Professor, you're wrong. These things don't actually matter. The Supreme Court is the third elected branch. And as soon as they have the seats, they will just overturn this for whatever they want, for whatever the Republican Party wants them to do. And it's the most right I've ever been. And I really wish I had been wrong. I wanted to believe in the world that he believed in. And I don't know if I haven't talked to him in a number of years. I don't know if he still believes in that world. I think he thinks that's aspirational. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have to be this way. I would say the state Supreme Court in Alaska, because we have a really unique judicial selection system, I think they actually do follow precedent and sort of read the plain meaning of statutes and the Constitution. I think they do apply the law in as neutral a way as they can. That is just manifestly not the case in the U.S. Supreme Court and in the federal judiciary.
Right. And I think what's been most depressing for me this morning is thinking about major earthquake last year, major earthquake this year. These 6 conservative justices will ostensibly be there for more years. So we're looking forward to earthquake after earthquake after earthquake. I mean, I know that's me drawing a pattern from 2 data points, but
it's way more than 2. I mean, it's way more than 2.
Well, yeah, but and the Voting Rights Act,
Sure.
happening roughly a decade ago.
Sure. Citizens United. I mean, there are lots of these things.
And Roberts writing in that Voting Rights Act that that the reason why they could gut it was because it wasn't needed anymore.
Sure.
And of course, then we immediately saw moves by state legislatures to limit the ability for certain folks to vote. So it's
even the way you just phrased that, they could do it. But that's not how the Supreme Court is supposed to function. They're not supposed to do things because they can do it or they could do it. They're supposed to be sort of compelled by the law to do things. So again, even if you agree on kind of the merits of some of these decisions, the idea that the Constitution mandates that they do them is just laughable. I mean, it's just not the case in a lot of these cases. And it's really unfortunate. And I think that, again, it's unfortunate, but hopefully the blinders are sort of falling from their eyes and they're realizing that that's all it is. And so it's a depressing thing to say, but if you want the Supreme Court to stop striking down laws and sort of reshaping the country in their sort of very, very particular, very far to the right vision of the country, you just have to win elections. I mean, there's no other way to do it. You have to win elections, and then you have to win these seats because they are just the third elected branch now. They are an extension of the Federalist Society and the particular strain of the Republican Party. And of course, there's a whole nother part to that, right? With what's his name, Leonard Leo, and the expensive fishing trips in Alaska, ironically, and the billionaires paying for people's college tuition, and then it's a particularly sort of moneyed portion of the conservative movement that has control of the court, we just live in an interesting time, unfortunately, and it's depressing. But there's really not any. The only real response to it is to continue to work and to win elections. And, there might be other responses as well. There are certainly these constitutional moments that happen in American politics where you get sort of extraordinary actions of protest and hopefully always peaceful protest, and other kind of results or actions outside of typical elections, especially if you see things like you were talking about that are limiting the ability of the electorate to actually have its say, right? If you are suppressing votes, then people are going to turn to other means of protest. Again, always should be peaceful, I hope.
You mentioned that Alaska Supreme Court is different.
Yeah.
And I think that we often think of ourselves as being lucky as being in Alaska, that things are different here, that we're not, that we do things differently. We have a lot of independence in the state. You and I as Democrats are a minority. I mean, for sure.
Yeah.
And yet we see imported legislation to our legislature all the time.
Sure. Yeah, and that, I mean, to a certain degree, I think that's always been the case. But, and again, not to bore people with this, but there is a really unique judicial selection program process here that was set up in our Constitution. And it's not just the Supreme Court, it's the whole Alaskan judiciary, which is sort of a model for the nation. It is a really good system that people aspire to work in, that produces generally pretty good results, pretty neutral results. And for exactly that reason, it's a target of the folks like from the Federal Society.
Because it's considered to be left, because it's not, I mean, that's how they want to paint it.
Sure.
In the same way that mainstream media is painted as leftist media.
Right.
That if that whole idea that an elected judiciary would be more impartial, which is an argument that you hear.
Sure. Right. And again, that's just a fig leaf. I don't even think they actually believe it. It's just what they have to say, because you can't just say, yeah, we want to break your judicial selection system and turn it into a more right-wing system. Like that isn't an argument people are comfortable making in the media or in elections. And so they have to dress it up with this kind of nonsense that everybody knows is nonsense. It is, whether it's elections or whether it's just getting rid of the Judicial Council and letting the governor have, further politicize the judiciary. We kind of know what the result would be. But it's sort of interesting, right?
We know what the result is that they would want.
Right. It is funny too. Like, I'll give you an example, like the Electoral College, for example. People make the argument, well, we need to have the Electoral College. We can't have a popular vote because otherwise the urban areas would sort of dominate the smaller states and the rural areas. And so I always turn that around on folks here in Alaska, and I'm saying, well, would you accept something similar within Alaska? So your principle is the rural areas shouldn't be dominated by the urban areas. That's your principle to justify, and small communities should be dominated by large communities. That's your principle to justify why votes should count more in Wyoming than they do in California. Fair enough. Can you apply that to Alaska? Should votes in Bethel or in Cordova or in Kotzebue count for 2 for every vote in the Mat-Su and Anchorage? And I've yet to hear anyone say, oh, yes, they should. Mm-hmm. Because we don't want that. We want one person, one vote. But it's the same principle. People they reach for an argument at hand, right? It's like how states' rights was used to justify things in the past. It's the state's right until the state is trying to do something that they disagree with. Mm-hmm. And then you'll see something like the Supreme Court striking down a state law, mm-hmm. right? Or like the University of North Carolina trying to diversify their people want local control until local control is something that they're opposed to, and then they're fine with the federal judiciary stepping in and getting rid of it. And by the way, I'm not advocating for a system where votes in rural areas count for twice as much as votes in Anchorage and Mat-Su. I don't think that's fair. But similarly, I don't think it's really fair that votes in smaller states count for more than votes in large states. And by the way, it's meant also that presidential candidates can just ignore Alaska because mm-hmm. they think we're going to go a certain way, and so we're completely ignored. It reduces Alaska's power.
100%. However, when we look at the Senate and we have Senator Murkowski and Senator Sullivan,
yep.
they carry an outsized influence that is not reflective of the population of Alaska.
Sure. That is sort of one of the decisions that we have made as a country. I mean, there were founding fathers that argued to not have a Senate, to just have something like the House of Representatives. Obviously, as an Alaskan, it isn't fair, that we have this outsized power, but we also are a state, that needs more funding for development, and we're a young state, and so I'm not advocating for abolishing the U.S. Senate. I am not. I am also self-interested in the sense of being an Alaskan, but I think there is both a principled argument for taking down the Electoral College, and also I just don't think it increases Alaska's power. Republicans think it does because it certainly increases Republican power, but there's no reason for a presidential candidate to stop in Alaska. There's no reason to pay any particular attention to Alaska other than the fact that we have more powerful senators. So
you just mentioned rural.
Sure.
And I think most folks nowadays know you as an Anchorage politician, but you were not raised in Anchorage.
No. I was raised in a little town called Eagle on the Yukon River, which I think the population is about 80 now, but I feel like it was closer to 150 or 200 when I was there in the early 90s. Till I was 7, I lived in Eagle, and then when I was 7,
you arrived at Eagle when you were like 6 weeks old.
Yeah. I don't remember. It was 3 weeks old or 6 weeks old. My parents were already living in Eagle. My parents were building a house there. My mom was pregnant. They had gone to UAF, and then they were school bus drivers in Girdwood for a little while. Then they were living in Eagle and building a house with my grandpa, who was a carpenter, and then they flew down to California to have me because my grandma was a nurse at Kaiser, and so they got a discount on me. If you know my parents, that's very much in line with they had me for free. My mom says I cost $27. That was the price of the digital thermometer. And then they flew back up, and after I was old enough to fly. So, yeah.
How did your parents end up in Alaska? And you said your grandpa was helping to build a house. I mean, how did your family end up in Alaska?
Well, my grandpa was down in California, but he came up to help. My parents met at a community college in Quincy, California, a place called Feather River Community College. And they came up to go to University of Alaska Fairbanks. I'm not sure how they even discovered UAF. I think they were just, it was the 70s. It was 1978. They were young, adventurous people, and they wanted to come up here. And my dad studied fisheries biology at UAF. My mom got a bachelor's of education and eventually became a special ed aide and later a librarian. And they just came up here, I think, to go to UAF and to have an adventure, and they stayed. And they lived in Eagle till I was 7.
Why Eagle?
Well, they traveled all around the state and they just thought it was beautiful there. They liked that little town. My dad also likes to be out like as far away from people as possible. He, or that my mom will accept, my mom was a little more, I think, social. My dad, he loves to be out in the woods or, in really small towns, there's nothing he hates more than traffic, and he never liked coming to Anchorage. He felt it was too big a city. And it's ironic because he grew up in the Bay Area. They both did. And so they came from this, very urban area and they wanted to go out to the middle of nowhere. Or the middle of somewhere, I should say. And then I wanted to come to Anchorage as a kid because, growing up in Eagle and then in Cordova, when I was 7, we moved to Cordova after the oil spill, they brought in a lot of folks, Fish and Game did. And so that's where I went to high school. But we'd come into Anchorage all the time. And I always sort of aspired to be in Anchorage from a relatively young age. And I love I went back to Cordova a couple weekends ago. I love it there. Kind of a tough place to be a teenager. And I just enjoyed coming into Anchorage. And to me, this was like our big, exciting city.
And you're the oldest kid?
Yeah, just me and my sister. My sister is 5 years younger than me.
Yeah. And she did not stay in Alaska?
No, she moved to Portland, Oregon, like a lot of young people do. And she went down there for college and she stayed. And my niece, she lives there with my niece now. And a lot of my cousins live there as well. But yeah, my parents recently retired and moved to Colorado, to a small mountain town outside of Durango. And so, yeah, unfortunately, I've seen, like you, I'm sure, a lot of friends and family leave the state. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that they don't see really opportunity here. Well, in my parents' case, they were here for 40 years and they were just ready for a change. And they love to go to national parks. It's a little easier to drive to kind of sort of a variety of places when you're in Colorado and a variety of national parks. They had spent 40 years in Alaska and they just were ready for a change.
You went to DC for college, American University?
Yeah. So I got a scholarship coming out of high school. I had spent a year in Japan when I was in high school. And so I wanted to go to the Foreign Service or, live abroad and do international relations. And there's a school called American University in DC that has a good international relations program. And they gave me a scholarship and Georgetown didn't. And so I went there. Enjoyed my time in DC, worked on the Hill, worked at a place called the Brookings Institution, did a bunch of other odd jobs, paid my own way through college. My parents didn't really have the financial resources to help me. So I worked in the summers, I worked during school, and then I had scholarships.
So you mentioned working on the Hill, the internship at the Brookings Institution.
Yeah.
It sounds like you were pretty politically engaged from an early age. Have you been really interested in politics in Cordova?
Not exactly. I had been like student body president. I'd done that kind of thing,
What was the class size?
There were 31 kids in my graduating class. Mm-hmm. Was it 19 boys and 12 girls? But who's counting? I'd been on like the Parks and Rec commission as like the student representative. I'd done that kind of thing. But no, I really thought I was going to do like international stuff, and be involved in policy in that way. And then between high school and college, I interned for Frank Murkowski. I did that. A lot of high school students do that sort of summer internship with our federal delegation. And that was interesting. But then, at American, I went to intern for Congresswoman Madeleine Bordalio, who was a Democratic delegate from Guam. I also got more involved in the college Democrats, and then I was sort of more explicitly political.
Were your parents Democrats?
My parents are Democrats. I think that's the number one thing that determines whether you're Democrat or Republican is what your parents are,
Although we have lots, my parents are Republican, Wilkowski's parents are Republicans. Sure. We have Representative Jamie Allard, whose parents are Democrats. So we definitely have a model in Alaska of folks being, and I think pretty much,
it's not totally outcome determinative, but I think it is kind of the number one thing that helps, were you raised sort of in a more progressive or a more conservative household. My parents were conservative in some ways, but very, they were both union members, very socially progressive. And, I was a Democrat and still am.
Jewish.
Yeah. On my mom's side. Yeah.
On your mom's side. So your dad's not.
No,
I was curious about that because I just think it would be an unusual life experience to be Jewish in Eagle and in Cordova. we don't think of them as having thriving Jewish communities.
No, there were very few Jews in those communities, and unfortunately, that's why I didn't. I don't speak Hebrew. I wasn't familiar. No, I just wasn't raised. My mom was Reform. There's actually a news article that was written in the Anchorage Press like 4 or 5 years ago, where I talk a lot about growing up as a Jew in rural Alaska, and I think the journalist did a good job. So I'd recommend that. We also talk about video games a lot in that interview, but it was a interesting part of my identity, and I got called various slurs as a kid, and
I'm going to contrast you with a previous podcast guest, which is Vic Fisher, who didn't find out he was Jewish until he tried to go into a Jewish cemetery during World War II, or leading up to World War II, and they asked him if he was Jewish, and he said no, and toured the cemetery. And then when they got back on the bus, his mom was like, "Oh, you're Jewish." But he did, in other words, raised completely
secular,
ignorant of that history.
Sure.
So I'm curious, like, were you told you were Jewish early on?
We were told that, my mother was Jewish, my grandmother was Jewish, my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. Me and my sister are Jewish. We celebrated Hanukkah. That was, for whatever reason, that was kind of the only holiday we celebrated. We didn't do Passover.
And you were out as Jewish in the community.
Yeah. I was known as Jewish in the community, which is something that I sort of chafed against as a young person because I wasn't very religious. And, I got teased, just as people do when they're young. I sort of became more Jewish in college when I was around Jews, and then even more so in graduate school when I was able to go to Israel a couple of times with various trips. And also when I was in the Peace Corps, I encountered sort of more open anti-Semitism, and in a weird way that kind of made me more Jewish. You know what I mean? It was like, well, there's this anti-Semitism. I lived near the Russian border, and there's a lot of anti-Semitism sort of in the former Soviet Union. And sort of encountering that kind of made me almost like rebel against it and want to embrace my Jewish identity more. And so when I got back from the Peace Corps, that's when I did grad school, and that's when I went to Israel. And when I got back to Alaska, at first I would try to go to the synagogue, the temple, Beth Shalom, like every 2 weeks, basically. Unfortunately, as I've gotten more busy as an adult, and in politics, I really only go kind of for special occasions, But I feel very guilty about it, which is part of Jewish culture as well.
Yeah. Was your dad religious?
No, my dad is not religious. His parents are Christians, but he was not religious.
And did you have a relationship with your paternal grandparents?
Oh yeah, no, they're very. Yeah, no, absolutely. It wasn't ever an issue. I mean, my grandparents were Christian, but they were sort of liberal about it. It didn't bother them.
His family's from?
They are from, I think his dad is originally from the Midwest. They met in California as well, and they grew up in California, and neither of them went to college. They worked, again, in Dublin, Pleasanton, and eventually they retired in a place called Pollock Pines, which is outside of Sacramento. And then my mom's side of the family, my grandpa, my maternal grandpa was a dentist, and his family's from New York, like many Jews. And then my maternal grandmother was the one who was a Holocaust survivor, came here in 1941. She actually went on to get a PhD in chemistry from Berkeley, which was unusual for a woman in the 50s. But then after my mother and my aunt were born, she went back to school and became a nurse. And so she was a nurse for a number of years. And that's sort of my family history.
Back to being a Democrat. And I might get in trouble for asking this, but I'll just say it. So when we were debating having ranked choice voting and open primaries here, I don't think it was a secret that you weren't a big fan.
Yeah, I wasn't opposed to it, but I sort of felt that people were pitching it as a silver bullet, and I was skeptical that it would turn out that way. I think that the jury is still out on what exactly the long-term impact will be. I think it's generally been a positive, and I certainly don't support efforts to overturn it, given the people just voted for it. So I think it should take a few cycles, and we'll see how it shakes out. I just don't think it's a panacea. But, and it sort of reverberated in kind of strange ways. Mary Portola was elected under the ranked choice system, but the ranked choice system wasn't sort of working as advertised. People bullet voted, right? And if they had ranked their preference, a lot of them
the red.
Right. If they had ranked the red, it's not clear that would have turned out that way.
Mm-hmm.
And there were other reasons that Mary won, including being a very compelling candidate, and the fact that the two other people who hadn't been cleared out in a traditional primary spent the entire race attacking each other, which is not what ranked choice voting is supposed to do. And so again, but in the bipartisan coalition in the state Senate, it's clear that a couple of those seats were won in part because of ranked choice voting. And so again, I want to see how things shake out, and maybe it will moderate our politics. It's hard to say.
You had a more difficult run for the Senate because of ranked choice voting. I mean, because you had a Democrat running against you
that would have been cleared out by the primary.
Cleared out by the primary, and then it would have just been you and a Republican. And,
right. And had the two of us finished closer in the final tally, and had our voters not ranked the blue, as it were, you could have had a Republican elected in a seat that is more than 60%, kind of left-leaning. But I think that's relatively uncommon, right? And it's sort of kind of, from my perspective, I guess all's well that ends well. But I did have that thought when I was running, and ultimately the actual kind of impact on the politics of Alaska as a whole is because the other Democrat didn't drop out. Because I'm sort of paranoid, I spent all the time working on my own race when I could have been helping the people that lost very narrowly. So that's kind of unfortunate, but So again, we'll have to see a couple of cycles. I haven't filed yet, but I intend to. I'll probably, I have some National Guard service coming up, as you know, and once that's finished in the fall, I intend to file for re-election.
Why did you decide to be a lawyer?
That's it's an interesting question. Part of it was just I wasn't ready to be done with school. Like, school was the thing I was always best at, to be honest. And I enjoy school. I enjoy learning. I enjoyed the places I was going to school. I saw a bunch of my friends doing it. I don't recommend people go to law school and become lawyers. Whenever anybody asks me about it, I try to dissuade them. And my notion is, if they are actually sort of destined, they really want to be lawyers and they need to be lawyers, then if I try to talk them out of it, they'll still do it. But if you can be talked out of becoming a lawyer and going to law school by me, then you shouldn't have gone to law school. I was very fortunate. I ended up in one of the few law schools that really focuses on policy and constitutional law, rather than corporate law, for example. And I've done corporate law, and it's fine, but it doesn't really sing to me, And so I was just very fortunate, and I got to go to school with some really incredible people, and and it turned out okay. But sometimes I do regret it. Sometimes I regret not just going and getting my master's in public policy and coming right back to Alaska and getting into the work that I actually wanted to do, which was policy work more than litigation. But Mara Kimmel once said to me, there are too many lawyers, but there aren't enough good lawyers. And
Mara Kimmel is the wife of Ethan Berkowitz, and she's, I know that that's not how she likes to be identified. She's the executive director of the ACLU in Alaska.
She's a very impressive academic and lawyer in her own right. She was, for a time, the first lady of Alaska. I'm sorry, of Anchorage. Anchorage, my fault. But she said, and I think that does resonate with me, that we do need more lawyers working in the public interest, working as public defenders, working in these jobs that don't pay as well and are extremely difficult. And so we do need those.
I interrupted when you were going to give a quote. What did you say?
No. I gave the quote. It was that there are too many lawyers, but not enough good lawyers.
Gotcha.
And I think that is true. Or even just people that are working in corporate law and other kinds of law, but are just, good at the craft and respectful and building the profession, and a lot of those folks go on to become judges. And again, in our system in Alaska, I think we do a good job of sort of weeding out the people that are doing it for the wrong reasons. But yeah, I'm a lawyer, but the only real law I practice right now is military law as a judge advocate in the Army National Guard. And I am, I don't want to appear ungrateful. I am very honored to have the opportunity to practice law and to have taken the bar and to have gone to law school. And again, I met amazing people, and it really does help in the work that we do as well. I can understand statutes and understand things like mens rea, and there are sort of nuances that I was able to pick up because I went to law school. We have fewer lawyers in the Alaska legislature now than I think at any other point. That's good and bad. But I do see, I think we're fortunate that we have people like Bill Lukowski and Matt Clayman and Andy Josephson that are practicing attorneys that have that perspective as well.
Why the military?
Well, I could ask you the same question. And you and I now, I think
we'd have different answers.
For me, it was, I read a lot of books and watched a lot of films, like a lot of young men, and I was always really interested in the military and in things like World War II, and even like some fiction that I would read. And to me, it's like we only get one life to live, right? And I mean, unless you believe in reincarnation, that's not really a part of Jewish tradition. We have one life to live. And so I want to have kind of the breadth of human experiences. And I'm reading all these stories and I'm reading all these accounts about the military and these millions of people that serve in the military. It seems this big gap in my knowledge, in my human experience. And that kind of was the primary reason I joined. And of course, I want to serve my country. I want to put on the uniform. I want to be a person that's called on if our country is threatened. But I also want to just have that human experience. What is it like to be in the military? And I got to say, like, after I went through that training in my first year, it is like you learn so much. It's this whole world, just beyond the gates on J-Bear, for example. So few people in our city get to really go and experience what it's like. And there's still big gaps for me. I haven't been deployed. I haven't been sent to war. I'm not a combat veteran. And I have a very mixed feeling about that. I feel guilty sometimes that I didn't serve in combat. But I've had other combat veterans say, like, you weren't asked to, you weren't sent, it's not your choice. You volunteered to serve in the military. If another large war happens and your service isn't needed, you'll be sent over, and even not having had that experience, and I don't claim that experience. And I don't run as a war hero, you know what I mean? Like, it's not part of my narrative. But I have had this other experience, which is being part of this incredible, often very frustrating, massive bureaucracy, but also this sort of facet of human experience called the military.
I'm going to answer the question. I had just finished PA school, and I had a lot of student loan debt.
Yeah.
And as a PA, I was entitled to student loan forgiveness, student loan repayment through the military.
Yeah.
And this was not that long after Don't Ask, Don't Tell had gone away. And I was allowed to serve openly, and I was about to turn 39. So there was an opportunity for me that was presented to me, and I took it.
Yeah.
I think many, many people do. I think that...
that's a totally legitimate reason to join the military.
I was to say, and there are people who are like, don't say that. But the bottom line is that there are many poor people.
Sure.
Not putting myself in that basket, but it's 3 hots and a cot when you're 18 years old and you're trying to figure out what to do with your life.
Yeah.
But that's the option there. But I want to say that for me, it really was about if openly LGBTQ people can serve in the army or the military in some fashion, they need to.
Right.
Because I've thought of it as like being a missionary.
Yeah.
Like, that I need to be present.
Yeah.
I need to represent.
No, I
need to be there.
I think that's fair. I'll say also in my case, I also got health insurance through the military. That was a huge benefit. Ironically, because I couldn't get private health insurance because I had a pre-existing condition. because of some sports injuries I had. But ironically, I was able to get a health waiver, and the Army would take me when private insurance wouldn't.
That's crazy.
It is crazy. We have a crazy system, although it was largely abolished by Obamacare. But even then, I mean, the stuff you get on the exchange is quite expensive and difficult to get. But so I mean, that was part of the motivation for me as well. But the primary motivation was that just wanting to put on the uniform and to experience what it was like to be in the U.S. military. And
you're a Democrat and you're Jewish. So you are your own brand of minority in the military and I don't think that's a surprise to folks that the military leans right.
But that was what Max Gruenberg was, right? Mm-hmm. You're the former person who's saying the same thing. He was in the Navy and he was Jewish and he was a Democrat, It used to be a little less uncommon, that is to say, a little more common rather. Like there used to be more Democratic veterans. There used to be more Democrats in the military, Democrats that served in the military, partly because of the draft, and because we had these large scale wars. And so you had people that, had served in the military. Now it's pretty rare. I think that you and I are the only ones in the legislature, unless I'm
who are
forgetting
currently
something.
in the Guard. I mean, there's 7 veterans in the House.
That are Democrats?
No. That's hilarious. There's 6 Republican veterans and 1 Democrat veteran, which is me.
Yeah.
And having deployed, I am a veteran, but so there are, but I meant that we are unusual nowadays.
In that regard.
So you ran for Don Young's seat, and that's 2014, and your name came on the radar. Mm-hmm. And I know you've given interviews and talked about this before.
Sure.
But it took some chutzpah.
Yeah. Good Yiddish word. I had worked, I'd worked on Capitol Hill. And as an intern and then a part-time staff, I'd worked in D.C. I sort of felt at the time that I knew more about federal policy than I did state or local policy. And so I felt like it was a job I could do. And there had been young Congress people before. But yeah, I mean, it took that. Yeah, I guess chutzpah is a good word for it. And so I decided I might as well do it before I had other things kind of preventing me from doing it. And it was a really positive experience, even though I didn't win.
How old were you in 2014?
I was 29 when I filed. No, yeah, that's right. I was 29 when I filed. I was 30 when the actual election happened. Wait, was I 28 when I filed? I think I was 28 next year. I was.
You'll turn 40 next year.
No, I'll turn 39 next year.
Oh, okay, then yeah.
Oh no, you're right. I'll turn 39 this year. Oh my gosh. Oh my god, that's so funny. I guess I will turn 40 next year. Right, and it'll be. Let's see. I ran for Congress, then the Assembly, then Mayor, then the Assembly, then the Senate. So I've run 6 times in a little over 8 years or 9 years. So. And
did the party immediately back you? I mean,
no.
Okay, so
no, I've never really. Maybe the first time I ran for Assembly. I wasn't. It's funny. I wasn't recruited by the party. I initially Matt Moore was also in the race. Obviously once I won the primary, they backed me. But it was the year that Begich was running, and so all the effort was rightly behind Mark Begich, and I understood that. Although I sort of chafed at it initially as a young person, but in retrospect, it made a lot of sense. And it was a great experience. It was a great experience for a bunch of reasons. I got to meet wonderful people. I got to get some new ideas out there, and I got to travel the state in a way that sort of working to middle class person from Cordova really doesn't get to. Like I'd never been to Kotzebue. I'd never been to Unalaska Dutch Harbor. I just never, unless it was a basketball trip, I didn't do a lot of traveling as a kid inside the state. We went to Fairbanks, we went back to Eagle, but I'd never been to Uktiavik, or it was called Barrow.
Alaskans have never been to Juneau.
Right. It's sort of wild and it makes sense. And so that to me was the best sort of personal thing, was going to those places and seeing those communities and experiencing those communities. And I lost, but I think that,
Did you ever think you were going to win at any point during that? I mean,
there was a brief moment. Don Young made these really repulsive comments about suicide. He sort of misspoke at an assembly in Wasilla, and then he had this disastrous performance at the Kodiak debate where he threatened to kill me backstage. And there was this kind of wave of money that came in, and I was on MSNBC, and so there was a moment there where I was like, oh man, maybe we can actually do this. This is great, But in the back of my head, I always knew it was a long shot, and that's fine. And it's sort of freeing, I could really get out there and be myself and be positive, and because I knew I didn't have a whole lot to lose.
Why did Don Young threaten to kill you?
Oh, there were news articles written about it. He had said something to me. He basically said, I looked into you. You're not a real Alaskan. And I was sort of puzzled by it. We were like walking up these stairs going to the stage. And I sort of touched him on his arm. And I said, Don, what do you mean by that? Like sort of, stop. And he said, don't you ever touch me. The last person who touched me ended up on the ground dead. And I was like, all right, man. And I had this sort of flush come over me. And I was like, am I going to get in a fight with Don Young? Like, am I going to punch Don Young? I was like, no, that's insane.
And this was as you were walking on stage?
Yeah, it was. We were walking up the stairs to like the back, the holding area behind the stage. And I was like, that's insane. Just catch your breath, relax. And then he was attacking me on stage, and sort of one of my responses to something he said was to reference what happened backstage. And that's how the journalists heard about it. And it became this whole news story. But anyway, so on the night of, actually, it's funny, just this morning, I had coffee with my former campaign manager, Travis Smith, who did a great job as my campaign manager, even though he was fresh out of college, but he was just incredibly hardworking and smart and just a great guy to be around. And I'm really glad he moved back to Alaska with his wife. But I remember him saying when the initial results came out, we were at this party, the election night party, and he's like, oh yeah, you've got like 39% of the vote or whatever it was. And that went up, and I eventually ended up with 41%, which, considering I had only $250,000 and no name recognition, was a positive. Yeah. And so I tell that to young people that are thinking about running sometimes, or people that are running in kind of longer shot races. I tell them, like, there's a sort of bad way to lose and a good way to lose. And the good way to lose is that you are comfortable with the decisions you made, the things you said, what you stood for, that you fought with honor, and that you campaign hard, and people will think of you as someone that could run again in the future or be hired for something in the future.
Right.
This is a multi-iterative game. This is not something that's just one and done. In almost every case, you're going to run again, or you're going to, and especially in Alaska, you're going to see people in the grocery store, So don't do anything that you're ashamed of, and work hard,
So you were on the assembly for
almost 7 years.
7 years, East Anchorage.
Yep.
Big thanks to your service on the assembly. I do want to just ask about the decision to run for the Senate. You had basically, a mayoral run, followed by an assembly run, followed by a Senate run.
Yeah.
It was a lot of campaigns in a row.
Yep.
I can't imagine that it was an easy decision to run for the Senate.
No. I actually, I had just recently been reelected to the assembly. And if you remember, what happened was everyone thought that Ivy Sponholz was going to run, and she would have been easily elected as a senator. And then about a week before the filing deadline, she puts up this letter saying, for family reasons, she's stepping away. And funny thing is, I was like on my way to the airport to go to a wedding. And while I was at the wedding, I got some messages, and when I got back, a lot of people were sort of encouraging me to run for the seat. Of course, there was another Democrat that was going to run for the seat, perhaps, and I had no quarrel with them. And so I almost didn't file. And then after I filed, I almost dropped out several times. And I had a number of people, particularly former people in the state house, asking me to stay in. And the feeling was that I was a positive, that I could help build the bipartisan coalition, which is exactly what we did, of course, in the state Senate. I was also in my last term on the assembly. I wanted to continue doing good work. And I felt that there were priorities that I had on the assembly that I could continue in the state Senate. But again, it wasn't an easy decision. and I almost dropped out a couple of times. I'm glad in retrospect that I didn't. I've really enjoyed working with my colleagues. I think we've helped to bring the temperature down a little bit on the Senate side, and do good work. And of course, I also want to continue fighting for my neighborhoods, although, of course, the neighborhoods I now represent are slightly different. It's kind of a Venn diagram where I live in the middle. I'm sort of in the western half of East Anchorage now, and even parts that aren't really considered East Anchorage, sort of the greater UMed area and Airport Heights and Mountain View. But I enjoy the process of earning those votes and those seats and then fighting for those neighborhoods as well.
I've only done one campaign.
Yeah.
And it was brutal. It was terrible. I just, you doing 3 campaigns back to back just seems like such a grind.
There were some dark moments, but in general, I sort of enjoy campaigns, to be honest. I like going door knocking and talking to people. I like calling people, even when it's for a donor call. It can be a little bit of a grind, of course, but in general, I like talking to folks. I like the ideas that come out in a campaign. And that's not to say it's all like sunshine and roses. Like there are definitely stressful moments on a campaign. But it's not, it's not, I have literally dug ditches for work. I have done jobs that are a lot harder than running for office. And, again, it's an honor to get elected, an honor to serve.
I don't know. It's I mean, for those of us who don't enjoy door knocking, who don't, that having to constantly sell yourself to strangers, although I would say that running for Don Young's seat in 2014, having a little bit of name recognition, you're not the same sort of stranger showing up at the door or the same stranger making the phone call.
Yeah, it gets easier, I would say.
I'd heard that. I would call folks, to donate who donated to Ivy Sponholz, and they didn't know who I was. They just didn't feel comfortable.
Well, people still
it was really awkward.
Plenty of people still don't know who I am. I mean, that's another thing. Politicians tend to vastly overestimate their own name recognition. And because I had that congressional run, people kind of vaguely knew my name, but they didn't know what I looked like. And so I'll show up at their door and they're like, oh, you're shorter than I expected, you know, or, oh, this is what you look like. I thought you were something else. And your name recognition fades very rapidly too. And so I door knocked for the state Senate after having just run for mayor and assembly. And people will be like, I show up on their door and be like, oh, are you a Democrat or a Republican? Like, what do you stand for? Like, I've heard your name, but I have no idea what your positions are, and again, politicians, they just vastly overestimate their own name recognition.
Has the Senate been what you expected?
For the most part, yes. And, I had worked in Juneau twice before. I'd worked not as a traditional staffer, but I'd worked for the National Guard and I'd worked for the Office of Public Advocacy right after law school. So I'd been to Juneau. I'd worked on, in the Capitol, helped pass legislation. And so some things, and I'd heard a lot about Juneau, of course.
You knew the hallways.
Yeah. But it is even more of a kind of navel-gazing bubble than I expected. People in Juneau, in that building, really care about what happens in that building. And I get it. I get why they do, because it reverberates throughout the state. But the idea, like we just talked about, politicians think they have all this name recognition. They also think that every little play, every little machination, every little thing that happens in a committee, that like the people,
one's watching.
Yeah, they don't know that you offered that amendment,
right?
And you can tell that story during your reelect, but in general, people they don't know.
Right.
It takes a lot of effort and repeated effort to be understood to stand for a particular thing.
And you had gone through the assembly during COVID, where you were national news, where the Anchorage assembly was tons of people watching and showing up. And so I would imagine that being in the Senate all of a sudden and no one watching or feeling like no one's watching.
Yeah, definitely the volume is turned down a little bit. But I have enjoyed it. I really enjoy having staff. I've got great staff. It's a very sort of formal and professional outfit compared to, and that's not to denigrate people that are on the assembly at all or the staff there. It's just set up differently. And I'll also say that this, Dunleavy and I disagree on a lot of things, but the leadership of the departments at the state level, I feel, And Dunleavy's office is frankly just more professional than the disaster that's the mayor's office in Anchorage right now. The mayor's office in Anchorage is a complete dysfunctional catastrophe, and it has been for a number of years. And that starts at the top. And I just don't have the same feeling with the state administration. And so that's been a little bit easier to work with. The other thing that's different, of course, is that on the assembly, you can conceive of something, get it written, and pass it very quickly, within a month in some cases. The legislature just takes longer. It's these larger gears that grind more slowly.
Are you happier in the Senate?
For a variety of reasons, I think my mental health is a little bit better right now, and I'm a little bit happier. But again, I don't want people to think I wasn't happy doing the work on the assembly with some really great people. I mean, there were awesome people in the clerk's office, on the assembly with me, in the departments, that I got a chance to work with. And being on the assembly, we got a lot done, and it was an honor as well. But I also, yes, I am happy to be doing this work in the Senate.
And you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think you worked out a lot more during session than I did. I gained weight. When I was stressed and didn't know what to do, I would go eat something. And I've learned that I cannot do that.
I found a good community of people to play basketball in Juneau, and I was fortunate enough to get a chance to play basketball. And so play basketball once or twice every week, and they have a little gym for us there. And so that certainly is good for your mental health. So you didn't have a
gym membership, and you didn't lift or do other stuff while you were there in Juneau?
Oh, no, I did.
You did?
Oh, no. I didn't have like an Elastic Club membership.
Oh, did you lift in that little legislative gym?
Yeah. I did that. And then I got to go, like I said, I was fortunate that I was able to go play basketball out at University of Alaska Southeast. So I found a little community to play with there. So that was great. And there was a legislative run, too, on Wednesdays. Anyway, this is... I don't know if you want to keep this in the...
No, I will.
When I say run, like a basketball run.
I thought you meant like a running group.
Oh, there probably is. I'm not a part of that. But I like to play basketball.
Okay.
Absolutely. And I play basketball on base here when I can.
Last question.
Sure.
A book that you would recommend to our listeners?
How to Lie with Statistics. So it's very short. I think it's like 90 pages. And it describes the way in which people use quote unquote statistics. And a lot of it's just graphs and charts to deceive people. How to Lie with Statistics.
Do you know who it's by?
I don't know who it's by. It's a very short book. I read it, I think, my freshman year of college, maybe my sophomore year of college. And I remember very distinctly
Daryl Huff.
I remember watching this presentation by Paul Ryan. Remember him?
Yes.
So Paul Ryan, before he was Speaker of the House, he was like this right-wing crusader. He wanted to slash Social Security and Medicaid and that kind of thing. And I remember this visual presentation that he did with all these graphs. And if you go through How to Lie with Statistics, he does all the things that they described here, all the ways to deceive people with, don't start the x-axis or the y-axis at 0, for example, to make changes look larger. Increase the size of the circle. So, if something doubles,
right,
they double the radius, which of course vastly increases the area,
right?
Things like that. And so, How to Lie with Statistics.
And so do you use that book now to call out graphs and things that we see, or do you use it yourself when making your own graphs?
No, I don't. I try to avoid what they do. That plus the econometrics I studied in grad school allow me to sort of spot bullshit. I don't have the I'll have a PhD in economics, and I don't know how. I spent a long time since I've done a regression analysis myself, but I can generally see when someone is trying to pull over the wool over my eyes, when they are conflating, correlation with causation, or they are using these graphical tools to deceive people. And that's the primary benefit, by the way, of getting something like a master's of public policy or reading a little book like this. You're not going to be able to do it yourself. You're not going to be able to create a misleading statistical study like the cigarette industry used to about cigarettes, or frankly, the oil industry used to about global warming. But you'll be able to spot it. And that is so crucial, especially all the misinformation and disinformation that's floating around these days. It's a crucial skill to be able to spot when someone is trying to bullshit you.
Man, I need to read this book really bad.
It's very short. It's not written at an advanced level. You probably know most of what's in there.
No, but I need it because I have to listen to a lot of presentations where I know that everything is being tweaked to deliver an agenda.
Yep.
And figuring out the best way of pointing that out.
This book by itself won't give you the tools, because even if you can spot those kind of things, you can have a misleading study or presentation that doesn't use those tips or tricks, but just fundamentally their data is flawed, or they are misleading you, or they're lying to your face, which is what we experienced with this mayor, right? And his people. Like, it's very difficult as legislators. If someone comes to you with lies on their resume, it's very difficult for us. We don't have private investigators to go check it out.
Right.
And similarly, if a department comes to you and says, this is the price that was offered, or this is the data we have, and they are just fabricating their data, that's very difficult to get around.
Hey, well, Forrest Dunbar, thank you, Senator Forrest Dunbar. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you to Maya Narang for making this podcast listenable, and thank you to you, our listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email eastanchoragebookclub@gmail.com. That's East Anchorage Book Club, all one word, @gmail.com.